Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving, whatever you did to celebrate. Ours was very low-key, but really nice. I, of course, ate too much, always, and I had a glass of wine with dinner, which is... I'm such a lightweight. I haven't had a glass of wine since July? No, August. I think it was August. And before that, I hadn't had a glass of wine in like almost 2 years. So it's not that I don't drink. I just drink so rarely that I'm such a lightweight. And between the tryptophan and the glass of wine, I just wanted to curl up in a ball and go to sleep, but I wasn't at my own house. And so I couldn't just curl up on the couch and go to sleep. I had to wait till I got home. But I mean, it was a really, really nice day, and we had a good time. My husband and I went to some friends of ours that we spend pretty much every Thanksgiving with, and it was her mom and stepdad who were there as well. So just 6 of us, but really fun, some great conversations, a lot of laughs, and good food. Not much more you can ask for, I don't think. Plus, we spoke with both sets of our parents and some of our family before we went over to dinner, and so, yeah. Good day. I hope yours was as well. Another author interview for you today. I'm speaking with Marcie Maxfield about her new novel, her debut novel. It's called M's Awful Good Fortune. It talks about a woman who travels a lot. She and her husband travel a lot for his job. They move a lot for his job internationally. And let me give you the description from the back. This is not your typical story about an American abroad. Instead, Marcie Maxfield takes readers on a deep dive into a woman's struggle between the desire for companionship and the demand for independence. M's Awful Good Fortune explores the expatriate lifestyle through the lens of a marriage coming apart at the seams, while at the same time tracing the lasting impact of sexual assault. As M's story weaves back and forth, both in time and between cities and countries, she finds herself stuck in a hole of loneliness, infidelity, and loss. But she doesn't stay there forever. An empowering, darkly humorous journey around the globe that ultimately arrives at a new understanding of conflict, compromise, and the complexity of relationships. That is the description of M's Awful Good Fortune. I love the alliteration of that last sentence: conflict, compromise, and the complexity of relationships. I love alliteration. I love threes, so works out nicely. I love the title and all the different takes that you could make of that. You know, M's Awful Good Fortune. Is it just that she has awfully good fortune, or is it awful and sometimes good fortune? Well, you're gonna have to read it to find out, or listen to this interview to find out. There is a lot of humor in this story, but it's not easy. It's not an easy story. As you heard from the description, there's struggles with this marriage as this couple tries to, figure out what it means that they are traveling for the husband's job, and what is M, the main character. What does that mean for her as a wife, as a mother, as a woman? They do have 2 children, and so they're taking their children when they move, and that adds levels of complexity to any situation. And then again, deciding to move for one person's job. At one point, M says that she used to make more money than her husband, and now she is having trouble finding her place. She does volunteer work. She does a lot of things to try and fit in with the new community wherever they live, but that's not always easy. And I know for myself, it takes me a very long time to transition into a new place. at least 6 months. I'm not the type of person that can just jump in and be like, hey, everyone, you're my new best friend. It takes me a long time. And so, there's just so many layers to moving and to marriage and family and relationships. And this book is nothing like the last book that I spoke to the author about, Summer Club, when I spoke with Catherine Dean Mazeroff on the last episode. But both authors, both books talk about that hybrid lives that a lot of women lead. And what does it mean that you're a wife and a mother and a woman and all of those other relationships? How are you balancing whether you're a stay-at-home wife and mom, whether you are out in the workforce, whether you're doing a combination of both? Both of those books and those authors talked about the struggles of those relationships and those finding the balance between all of those disparate pieces of a person. So and as we all know, someone's going to judge us regardless. If we stay home, there will be judgment. If we work full time and the kids are in daycare, there will be judgment. If we try to find that balance, maybe working part-time, raising kids part-time, not part-time, it's a full-time, but you know what I mean, working part-time, and as well as raising the kids, someone's going to judge. There's always the judgment. But enough of my soapbox. Let's go ahead and turn to the interview. Again, the book is M's Awful Good Fortune. The author is Marcie Maxfield. Hi, Marcie. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here.
Thank you for being here. And we are here to talk about your novel, M's Awful Good Fortune. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Oh, sure. So I am a late bloomer writer. But I think I always wanted to be a writer, and I was always writing and journaling and noodling. But it isn't until fairly recently that I've begun publishing this book. And prior to this book, I had an award-winning play at the Hollywood Fringe Festival. And in terms of a broader introduction of who I am, and as it relates to the book, I call myself a serial expat. I have lived in all of the countries that are in the book, which is China, Korea, Japan, France. I've also lived in Spain, and I'm based in California. And most of the moving around has been attached to my husband's career, so I'm what's called a tag-along wife. And that's kind of a debate. It's a term that people use sort of sarcastically, but it does mean that I have been attached to my husband's career on a lot of these moves. And in the book, I think I say it makes me feel like I talk about the other term, which is trailing spouse, which makes me feel like a turtle with a shell on its back. But at any rate, there's a whole bunch of us out there who move around as expats.
Yeah, and actually, you mentioned both tag-along wife and trailing spouse on the first page of the novel, and triggers is too strong of a word, but I saw that phrase trailing spouse, and I find that phrase a little problematic in a lot of ways, but it's accurate. So
it's accurate, and it is problematic. Nobody really likes to be called either of those things, but actually, the most common term is trailing spouse. I almost never use it. I use the word tag-along wife. And then I like to put it in perspective and mention that I consider Michelle Obama to be the ultimate queen of tag-along wives, because she had this brilliant career as a lawyer in Chicago, and she ultimately had to quit her job and move to DC because her husband had an even bigger mission. So tag-along, it's a term that is much broader than just the specific use I was using it as, being an expat wife, because I wanted people to begin to look at all the different ways in which we sometimes are tagging along on somebody else's steam.
Yeah. So can you give a bit of an overview of the story itself?
Sure. So M's Awful Good Fortune is loosely or broadly based on my experience living in the countries that I've mentioned. And the heart of the book is really about the themes of marriage and compromise, and how you navigate dual careers in a marriage, and marriages that experience certain kinds of friction and also infidelity, and how you navigate these issues and sustain a marriage, or whether or not you should sustain a marriage. So anyway, I think M's Awful Good Fortune is about being an expat living all over the world.
Yeah, with some pretty heavy topics thrown in there, just, for good measure.
Well, it's funny because I started out writing a memoir, and I do typically write from my own personal experience. So I thought, I'll write a memoir, and a lot of the inspiration, oddly, came from the politics in our country, and how I wanted to turn off the news and do something more creative and more sustaining for myself, and something so that at the end of of course, we thought there wasn't going to be an end of the Trump administration, but at the end of it, I would have something creative to show for it, more than just pink pussy hats. Because I had been very involved. I had gone to Washington, D.C. in March with the Million Women's March, or whatever it was, the Women's March on D.C. So I was very involved in all of that. And then I decided instead to really focus on my writing and do something creative. But all of that, I think, really started to influence the book I was writing, because I could no longer just write a simple book about, I've lived in Paris and I've lived in Korea. And I began to really look at the impact of my husband's career on my life, and connect it to what's going on with a resurgence of patriarchal forces in our country, and women losing ground and rights. And so it all started to come swirling together. So my idea of writing a memoir about living overseas as an expat turned into a much more feminist political statement.
Well, and it's political from the perspective that M mentions throughout the book, being an expat and then seeing this country from, an outsider's perspective,
right?
Because you start seeing, you're not immersed in it. And so you see it from other people's perspective. I would imagine that you've had that similar experience in your time living abroad.
It's fascinating to live abroad and see the United States from that point of view. For one thing, for example, we were living in Paris during the Clinton administration, when there was a big brouhaha about Bill Clinton having extramarital affairs. And the French were laughing at us because, of course, at that time, I think it was Mitterrand he was just very publicly involved in an extramarital long-term relationship. And it's just, the French thought we were very provincial. More interesting, maybe, is that I was also living there during 9/11. And so I actually experienced 9/11 outside of the country, watching the news in French, which I didn't particularly understand, but I was getting the gist of it. And then being with a group of international women who were anywhere from being French, Scottish, English, Australian, whatever, and the entire and the sense that how America proceeded, how the United States proceeded after that event was not well received in Europe and around the world. So that was also interesting time to be overseas. I think that I don't write about a lot of that. I don't write about the specific politics, but you do get to see your own country from a different perspective, and certainly from a more personal perspective. I've dealt with healthcare incidents in a lot of different countries, and I can just tell you, it's a lot easier to get in and get out and no bill. It's like, really? Like you're not going to charge me for the X-rays?
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard lots of stories from different countries about and what it actually costs when you leave.
Yeah. When they actually decide to send you a bill.
Yeah.
But I know once I was flying from Paris to Corsica, and I thought I had sprained or done something to my arm. So we landed in Corsica and we went to a hospital, and they just saw me. They just saw me immediately. I think I was in within 5 minutes. They took an X-ray. They said everything was fine, gave me some pills or whatever, and no bill, just sent me on my way.
Yeah. That's a little counterintuitive when you're used to a certain system.
I was like, okay, thank you. So, I mean, I don't want to America bash, but it is one of the benefits of living overseas. And I think everybody in our country really should have to spend some time in a different country, sort of like mandatory Peace Corps thing, because it is a big world, and some things we do right and some things we don't do right. And it would be nice to share knowledge and experience and resources.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Everyone does things differently, and there's pros and cons to any country that you move to. All right. Now that you know a little bit more about Marcie and M's Awful Good Fortune, let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about the main character, M, and what about her readers might find compelling. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Marcie Maxfield about her debut novel, M's Awful Good Fortune. Let's return to that interview. Can you talk a little bit about, can you talk a little bit more about Emma, the main character, and what about her might resonate with readers?
Sure. So, so at some point I moved from writing what I thought was a memoir. I was never actually using my own name. I was always using the character's name of M. So I guess I was never really writing a memoir. But I like to say that that she photobombed my book, because once I was freed from really what my experiences were and able to see them through M's eyes, she just took over. And really the book is all hers. It's all her voice. It's a voice-driven book. It's a thematically driven book, and it is not a plot-driven book. It's nonlinear, and it's really about being in the mind of this woman who is a hybrid. She's a mother, a wife, a professional, also a professional volunteer, because she has to give up her job so often. But she's committed, she's angry, she's badass, but sometimes she gets walked all over. So she's a very complicated character, and I think women will be able to appreciate this, because I feel like so many of us are are leading these hybrid lives where we're raising our children, we're working our careers, we're trying to keep we're involved in our marriages, we're involved in our communities, and we're doing so many different things. And so I feel like women will understand where this character is coming from, what her frustrations are, what her angers are, why she sometimes fights back, and why she sometimes just lays down. And so she's I think I made a list. I made a list of adjectives that I have been on reviews for her, and it really makes me happy. So here we go. She's funny, brutal, ferocious, hilarious, cool, sarcastic, biting, raw, human, relatable, blunt, sassy, angry. She's really a mix of all of these different things that I think so many women really are, because we're not one-dimensional, we're not two-dimensional, and we're living really we're complicated lives. And I think that the idea that most women today work outside of the home, and what we haven't really navigated as so well is how to manage dual careers, whose career takes front seat when, or what happens to somebody's career when somebody else's career impacts it, which is again the Michelle Obama, the concept that Michelle Obama had this booming career that she really had to scrap to follow Barack to the White House, and then had to remake herself. And so essentially that is what I had to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think at one point, if I'm remembering correctly, M says something about she was the one that was making more money at one point in the relationship, but then, she's the one that becomes the trailing spouse.
Absolutely. I think that when this is based in my own experiences, that when my husband and I were younger, the time when he first started traveling, it's because he couldn't get jobs. We lived in Los Angeles and he couldn't get jobs in Los Angeles, that his skill set was more employable overseas. And he wasn't necessarily making more money than I was, but he needed to be employed. And he's certainly making more money than me now.
Right. But then, what do you do when that's the case? Do you say, cool, honey, go have your job overseas, I'll be here when you get back? Or do you pack up and go with?
Right. And I think that I think the journey of Em is that she tries everything. She says, okay, cool, go overseas. I'm going to stay here and keep my job because I really like it. And her marriage practically falls apart. And that's, I think, when infidelity first enters into the marriage. So the next time she goes, okay, I'll quit my job and I'll come with you because I want to keep my marriage together and you're the father of my children. And then she's depressed. And so I think by the time you get to the third post with M, she discovers writing, and writing becomes this thing that she does that makes her whole, that fills the holes that have been left in her life by following her husband's career. But from my point of view, is me, when I look back on the whole experience, I realized that I was equally part of the problem, in that I had an inability to redefine myself and to really just say, oh, okay, I'll follow you, but I will become a writer. And I was still hanging on to this other concept of myself as a career woman, and it wasn't working. The dual careers in a situation where one person's international and one isn't, wasn't working. And as I look back on it, I think, oh, why didn't I have a light bulb and become more flexible? But that wouldn't have made a good novel anyway. So I really dug in. I dug my heels in. And the character it's probably a good time to introduce the concept of autofiction, which is the idea that a piece of writing is grounded in authentic reality, but highly embellished. So I get confused when I talk about the character M versus me, Marcie. But the best way for me to describe this is that she's 10% of my thought process blown up into 100% of a character. She's very authentic for that reason, but she is not me. So that's why I can say I look back on it in my own life and think, damn, girl, why weren't you flexible?
Mm-hmm. Well, hindsight is always lovely and helpful. But in terms of, you started writing a memoir, but the character of M existed. Was that because your first name is Marcie, that starts with an M? Is that coincidence or part of your plan?
No, I started writing and I never wanted to use my name. And I don't know why, but that was just an organic decision. So yeah, it is because my first name is Marcie, because because MEM backwards is me, so there's a little code in there. But she is a character that is a part of me, but she's not me. My marriage is not really the same marriage that was in the book. But it was a lot of fun to write because she's kind of says whatever she wants to say and doesn't hold back.
And you mentioned earlier the nonlinear nature of the book. Did you start out to write it kind of in that nonlinear way, or did that develop as you wrote?
My writing process is typically nonlinear because I don't sit down with possibly because I'm not writing a pure work of fiction where I'm making a story up. So I'm doing an exploration of on a theme. So what I'll do is I'll just sort of brainstorm all the things that I want to talk about, and I write about them as they come up. So I don't write linearly, but additionally, I didn't want this to be the story of my life. I wanted this to be a work of fiction, so I didn't want it to say, and then we moved to. So, because it wasn't about that. There are a lot of books out there about the expat experience, which is, and first we lived here, and then we moved there, and then and so I thought, I was going to cut and paste anyway.
Makes sense. There's a chapter in the book called "I Am Not a Geisha," and in the copy of the book I received, there's a card with artwork on it and a quote from that chapter. So all of that tells me this is important. Can you talk a little bit about that chapter and the artwork and the card, etc.?
Yeah, geisha. Well, I love this scene about geisha because first of all, there's this idea that a tag-along wife is kind of like a geisha, although she isn't, but it's sort of a woman who doesn't have full agency. And so when this piece of art comes up, M is bidding on it at an auction, at a nonprofit, an overseas nonprofit auction. And she's bidding against a guy who's essentially very like her husband. She's essentially, a fat cat, expat man with a wallet in his pocket. And she's like, oh no, you're not going to win this battle. So I think it's a great, just a pivotal scene where she just goes toe to toe with this person and says no. And she has her own money from a previous job. And so she's like, no, I'm buying it. I'm buying it with my own money. And no matter how high you go, I'm going to be right there bidding against you. So I just think it's one of the times when she just claims her own agency and fights back.
In some ways, it's a bit of a microcosm of some of the bigger themes in the book as well.
Absolutely. It's just it's a metaphor of the bigger issue of what's going on in her own marriage. And so she stands up and says, I'm not a geisha.
All right, time for the second break of the podcast. When we come back, I will give you a content trigger warning that we are going to be talking a little bit about the sexual assault that happens in the book. So if you want to just skip that first part of the interview when we come back, that is your prerogative, but I want to let you know that it's coming up. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Marcie Maxfield about her book, M's Awful Good Fortune. Let's go ahead and return to that interview. And just as a reminder, this section does contain a conversation about sexual assault, so just a trigger warning. Some of the other tougher themes throughout the book are, the impact on a marriage of being expats, of being a trailing spouse, etc., but also the impact of sexual assault. And can you talk about, it's such an important topic, but also I can imagine very difficult to write about. So can you talk about the inclusion of that topic within the novel?
Yeah, at some point, and this was one of the last pieces that I wrote, pieces of the puzzle. And at some point, people were saying, well, why didn't she just leave him? Why didn't she just live alone? And so I had to sit with that. I was like, well, I don't know. I thought I've already explained that. I thought, she wanted to keep her family together. She loved her husband, wanted to be with the father of her kids. But I woke up one morning and this story, this scene that you're talking about of a sexual assault just came and it just wrote itself. And I looked at it and I thought, well, this doesn't have anything to do with my book. Why did I write that this morning? And then I sat with it and I thought, oh, what is the impact of sexual assault? The lingering, lasting impact on women. It's subconscious. It's the idea that you might not be safe living alone, that it's dangerous out there. And so I really included it for that reason. And I guess it was my subconscious talking to me about, because I wouldn't ever sit down with you and tell you that consciously I was thinking, well, I didn't leave my husband because I was a survivor of sexual assault. But that's not how sexual assault and PTSD works. And I wanted to include it in this book, but not make it a book about this issue. I think it's a really important issue, but I didn't want often it's just when it's in a book, it's the main topic. It's a book about rape or a book about sexual assault. But I think that the numbers are so enormous. The survivors of sexual assault in this country, there are so many that it's just almost commonplace. And how is that impacting women as they walk in the world? And how is it holding them back? And how is it holding them back from living their strongest, fullest, most powerful lives? So I think, like I say, that sexual assault is it's akin to, in the character in this book has a limp, which she turns into a swagger. It's just that's from a childhood accident. And so I sort of tie it into that, which is the idea that it's something that you carry with you from a childhood accident that impacts how you move in the world.
I think it also makes sense in terms of, the question, well, why didn't she just leave her husband? I think so often women get that question for so many things. Well, why didn't you just,
Right.
why didn't you just report it? Why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you just do X, Y, and Z? And it's never that simple.
No, and that's why the first line of the book is, sometimes I wish you would hit me. And not that I would ever let anyone hit me upside the head. And that's been controversial. And some people have wanted me to take that out. But that's the thing. If somebody is in our country and in our society, if somebody is hitting you, there's just no question about it. Everybody says, of course, you have to get out of this situation. But if somebody is just overpowering you or diminishing your career potential, it's not a reason to leave someone. I think that had I had an opportunity to redo some of those things, I would do them differently. And on the other hand, I'm really fortunate because I held my marriage together and was able to become the person I always wanted to be. And it wasn't as if my husband is abusive. It was as if he was, like so many men in this country, just in a default to the patriarchy position. And it was surprising to me, because I'm a very strong woman, to have, and he's not a particularly, bullish kind of guy. It was just this default to it's a default to the patriarchy that still exists. And so I really was trying to challenge women to start thinking about how this is impacting them in their lives also.
In terms of character development, some of this is obviously, autobiographical in ways, but also fiction. So in terms of character development, did you have a pretty good idea of characters as you started, or did some of those characters develop as you wrote? How did that process work for you?
Okay. So, the M character, like I said, she just wrote upon the book. She just sort of took over. And once she started to take over, I just let her have full reign of her voice. I didn't start out with a concept about that character development. That was just a gift from the gods. Thank you. From the husband character, G, I just, as I said, I think that he was as much channeling all of the talking heads on the right wing world of politics, who was just it was just, he was a very political character, not necessarily my husband. And I give my husband a lot of credit for being so supportive of my book, but my husband is a theater major. And so he was like, yeah, you need an antagonist. I'll be it. So I went, oh, good. So in terms of character development, most of the situations were situations that happened, but not necessarily as they happened or with the people. So I think that, for example, Andra, the best friend character, is really a composite of all the best friends I've ever had along the way. So I don't sit into a character study because so much of it is based in authentic experience, if that's your question.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Thank you. Are you working on anything new now?
I am working on something new, and it is not with the character M, even though I think I might bring M back because she's so much fun and people have really, really responded so well to her. But I am working on something that is also about women but more about identity, and we'll see how that goes. You'll have to stay tuned.
I think that's the best thing any author can say at this point in a writing process. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Are there any other of your other writings? This is your debut novel, but you've written. So are there any other of your, are there any other writings you would like to highlight?
No, because I would, no, not really, because my play is not really available. I did have the play called Girls Together Always, and that was 10 monologues about growing up female in America. And so I guess this is the kind of this is the milieu that I write in. I write women's stories. I typically write first person, but then I don't stick to the truth because I want it to be more. I'm into the craft also of allowing voices to run free. So I'm not really writing memoir, but I am writing autofiction. My publisher said autofiction doesn't exist, but I think it does. And I think it's just like women are hybrids right now between all the different things, the balls that they're juggling, that also writing right now is in this amazing point where there's so much hybrid writing going on. And I'm uncomfortable with all of the labels because if I say it's memoir, people would say, but it didn't really happen like that and you created a character. And if I say that it's fiction, people go, but isn't it based on your life? And so I'm like, yeah, I'm a hybrid. I'm a hybrid writer because I will always be writing from personal experience, but I'm very involved or very concerned with craft as well. And not that memoirists aren't concerned with craft, but I will always push the writing and lose the truth if I think it'll make a better scene.
Mm-hmm. I think it's changing in the world of publishing and publicity nowadays, but it's been so genre focused for so long that the fact that people are writing across genres, it's hard for traditional maybe publishers or publicists to, there's not a specific box to put.
There's not a box. And it's interesting because my publisher at the beginning, when I first started working with them, and this was pre-COVID, was like, well, autofiction doesn't exist because when you walk into a bookstore, there is no shelf for autofiction. And I'd love to have that conversation with her today because I'm like, well, when was the last time anyone walked into a bookstore? I mean, I love bookstores, but our lives are completely different. Our shopping habits are completely different, certainly in the book world. And so the idea that the category for my book is based on a brick and mortar store is, I think, a little behind the times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it takes a while for things like that to catch up. And time for our third and final break of the podcast. When we come back, Marcie will be sharing a little bit more about her journey to becoming a published author. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Marcie Maxfield.
Right.
You mentioned that you were a late bloomer writer. Can you talk about the process then that made you start writing and then also start writing for publication?
Right. Okay. So I think in college I wanted to write. But it was just, I wanted to write. I wasn't doing, I was journaling. I was journaling, then I was writing poetry. Then I thought I worked early on, I worked in the music industry and I was writing song lyrics and stuff like that. But I never really took it seriously. And my business career definitely took off. And I for some reason, I just thought artists know that they're artists. And it's one of those things, if you could go back to your young self and go, you do know what you are, but I didn't have the self-confidence. And I didn't start seriously writing till I was living in Paris. And I thought, well, what am I going to do with myself for 4 years in Paris? And I took a writing class and I was published in Paris rather quickly. Several of my pieces were published in a literary journal called Upstairs at Duroc. And so I had that moment of, small but community success. And then I became a co-editor on this magazine, and I had to read other people's works and pick them. And so as you've gathered, I have a very honest, just a very raw, honest voice on the page, a strong voice. It's been actually called an androgynous voice. And it's a voice that I think men and women equally appreciate. And so I picked work that was, as this co-editor, I picked work that was more like mine. And the other editor was like, that's not real writing. And I just always had the sense at the very beginning that I still wasn't really a writer, and that my work was perceived as, I don't know, like I used to think of myself as being a hammer in a china shop, a sledgehammer, that my voice was like a sledgehammer. And what I didn't understand, that was my gift. My voice is kind of like a sledgehammer, and now I'm owning it, but it took a long time for me to begin to share my work with people. So I've been writing for years. It wasn't until my play at the Fringe that I ever allowed my work to leave my computer, and it was really well received, and I won an award for it. And I was like, wow, okay, well, I'll just keep doing this. But I think a lot of it is just a lack of self-confidence and a long journey to owning my own strength and power in terms of being a writer, and being comfortable with my voice, not necessarily being like anyone else's voice, and my style not necessarily being like anyone else's style either.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe instead of a sledgehammer, your voice is more like Thor's hammer. You're a superhero.
I'm a superhero. There, thank you for turning that into something. Yeah, because for years I just thought, oh, I lack finesse, and because that's kind of what I was a very, very arty environment, and very poetry arty, and I love poetry, and I actually write poetry now. But I just had this sense that my voice wasn't refined, and it's not refined. That's really the best part of my voice. So it took a while to own my own voice. If I can say anything to anyone out there, just own your own voice, because right now is a great time to be breaking molds and doing your own thing.
Actually, that's the perfect segue into my follow-up question of, do you have advice for aspiring authors? And I would assume that'd be a big part of it.
Yeah, that is part of it. Yeah, okay, here's my advice. Just write. Just write, and don't even know it's okay if you don't know to what end, just keep writing. And also read. Writers need to read. And I know you're probably going to come up and ask me who I'm reading, but which is, I think that you can't live in a vacuum where you only write. You need to read, you need to get inspired, you need to be a good ally to other writers, and don't give up.
You are correct. That is my next question. Who are your go-to authors and genres when you do read for yourself?
Yeah. Okay. So for the longest time as a young woman, Joan Didion just did it for me. And I'm not going to back off of that because she's amazing. And, but the literary muse for M's Awful Good Fortune was Junot Diaz. And his book, This Is How You Lose Her, was just dog-eared on my desk. And whenever my writing went flat, I would step away from the computer and get out a pencil and get out my notebook and just start free writing until, first I would read whenever it went flat, I would read some pages of his work and I would go, okay, you can do this. And then I would sit and I would free write. So I'm a huge fan of Junot Diaz. He blurbed my book, which kind of made my life. His work is astonishing. It's just alive and vibrant, and it mixes language, and it's street, and it's highbrow at the same time. It's everything. So my two JDs, Joan Didion and Junot Diaz. But lately I've been reading a lot of women writers because I'm a woman writer. And so I'm into Lydia Yuknavitch, who wrote The Chronology of Water, which is being made into a movie. And I think I can announce that my book has been optioned for a mini series, although they still have to attach talent and get a production company, but still, right. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, congratulations.
Yeah. And I'd love to see Em on the screen. And I'm also reading, I'm just listing a few things that I've been reading this year. This year I read Trust Exercise by Susan Choi, which is a brilliant book. It's a book that halfway through, in the middle of the book, completely just turns the book upside down. I love when something surprises you like that. It was just crazy and good. And I'm also on my bedstand is Poser by Claire Dieter, which is a memoir. The structure is 23 yoga poses. And then every chapter is a different yoga pose that she learns, but also how it relates to how she's learning and growing in life. And what I really like about this book is that it's completely like you're just talking to a friend. Claire Dieter has this way of just being so almost like not oblivious to the fact that she's writing and other people are going to read it. It's just so honest and authentic and not stylized. I think my work is highly stylized, and her work is just really, it's just really from her point of view. And also what's really cool about this book is that you can read it in increments, 23 yoga poses. You don't have to you can read about a yoga pose and stop. So it's a great book to have on your bedside table. Those are my books.
Well, thank you. In terms of your internet presence, if you could share your website and any social media where people might be able to find you.
Sure. I have my website is my name, marciemaxfield.com. And I have an author's page on Facebook, and it's probably Marcie. It's not actually, it's I have to look that one. Anyway, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm sort of on Twitter. It's hard to keep up with all of it, don't you find? And but if you go to my website, you will find me in all of those places.
Yes, it's definitely hard to keep up, especially because they keep, not they, whoever they are, but new social media keeps getting added to the
list. Right, exactly. New social media keeps getting added, and I'm like, okay, but at some point I actually have to write.
Right.
So anyway, I'm on all those places, and you can find me there. And I'm a highly accessible person. I have my real life email out there in case people want to do book clubs. I've been doing a lot of book clubs, and I find that it's a lot of fun for me, and because everybody's living on Zoom anyway, that it's easy for me to attend people's book clubs. So if anyone wants to contact me about making an appearance at a book club, happy to do it.
Wonderful. Thank you. In terms of our conversation today, we've talked about a lot of different topics, but is there anything that you would like to highlight that we haven't covered so far?
Gosh, I don't think so. I think that we've covered it. Yeah. I think what I wanted to add was the whole book club thing.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you so much then for taking the time to talk to me about writing, especially about writing M's Awful Good Fortune. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me to come on, Sarah.
Thank you again to Marcie for joining me to talk about M's Awful Good Fortune and being a trailing spouse and everything else that we talked about here. She made a joke after we were done recording about this is why she doesn't write linear books, and is that she just doesn't think linearly. And I think that's great. I love how people's brains work, and we don't all think in linear patterns. Some of us do, some of us don't. And so hearing different voices and different ways that we process things, I just love and find fascinating. So thank you to Marcie. And before I wrap this episode up, I wanted to say that this book is incredibly well timed for me personally. I wanted to leave this till the end of the episode because I didn't want to take away from Marcie's interview or anything to do with the book. But I'm always fascinated how, even though interviews get set up months in advance, often they can be, the timing of interviews or different authors is amazing to me sometimes. So I am actually, my husband and I are moving to Portugal in February. It sounds so weird when I say it out loud. My circumstances aren't exactly like M's or Marcie's, but we are moving to Portugal. I will, in a sense, be a trailing spouse, although not in as much of a sense as M in the book. But yeah, it was just interesting to read about M's experiences and hear about Marcie's experiences, and then know that I am moving to a new country, and I'm excited, but I am terrified beyond belief. You have no idea. I have not traveled a lot in my life, and so moving to, and I've moved a lot. I have not lived in the same place for more than 3 years since I went to college, and so I think that has been, I don't know, 27 moves the last time I counted, counting little tiny moves between, but I've not lived in the same place for more than 3 years. Actually, coming up on December 1st, will mark 3 years in this current house that we are in. And so I'll get 3 years in about 2 months before we move another time. But yeah, so I haven't traveled much really. I've lived in, I keep backing up and restarting my sentence, but I've lived in Montana, I've lived in Texas, I've lived in California, and then in Pennsylvania, back to Montana, back to California. I've lived in several states, obviously, but moving to a different continent is a huge undertaking, and we are in the process of getting visas and downsizing the house, and just, wow. Yeah. I just say that because not to say, hey, look at me, but more because this book was so well timed for me personally that it was just really interesting that the timing was what it was. So thank you to Marcie for writing the book and also for just, happening to be on the podcast at such a timely time, an opportune time. I appreciate your conversation. And I appreciate you, my listeners, of course, as always. If you are a fan of this podcast, please do me the honor of leaving a review that can be written or starred. Either one helps. If you it doesn't even have to be a long review. It can be a 1-sentence review, but leaving a review is a huge boost to the podcast. Also, if you are not doing so already, follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Lately, I've been most active on TikTok, but active on the other 3 as well. So would love to hear your thoughts, love to hear what you're reading, and just love to hear from readers. So hit me up on social media. I hope you will join me for the next episode when I will have a returning author on the podcast. Brenda Marie Smith will be joining me to talk about the second book in her series, and this book is called If the Light Escapes, and she joined me the first time to talk about the first book in this series. So join me for that. I'm really looking forward to having Brenda back on the podcast. In the meantime, hope you're having a fabulous weekend. Hope you are getting lots of naps to sleep off that tryptophan. And when you're not napping, I hope that you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.